The Illuminate Arts and Faith Conference in Chattanooga, Tennessee wants to help you find your tribe. Do you get way too excited about quoting Wendell Berry or C.S. Lewis in conversations with coworkers? Does your Spotify playlist include hymns, a little jazz, and a whole lot of Andrew Peterson? Join your tribe at Illuminate March 31 and April 1 for education and inspiration from speakers Russ Ramsey, Douglas McKelvey, John Hendricks, and others. Find a complete list of session topics and ticket information at southern.edu/illuminate.
In 2024, I set out to meet as many poets as I could and spend an hour with each one. I got more than I bargained for, more insight, more clarity, more hope. It's proved to be one of the richest highlights of my life. 17 writers, 17 deeply human conversations that made me sit up and pay attention. Franz Kafka once said, if the book we're reading doesn't wake us up with a blow to the head, what are we reading for? A book must be the axe for the frozen sea within us. And that's what I hope this new book will do. I hope it wakes us up, my friends. I hope these conversations will be the catalyst for something to be reawakened, re-enchanted, and reinvigorated. It's called An Axe for the Frozen Sea, Conversations with Poets About What Matters Most. I'm Ben Palpin, and I hope you'll come and listen in as I spend a little time with poets like Lucy Shaw, Malcolm Guite, Dana Gioia, and Lee Young Lee. Pull up a chair at the table as we dig into what it means to write well and to live well. An Axe for the Frozen Sea is now available from Rabbit Room Press. Visit the store at rabbitroom.com, or better yet, ask about it at your favorite bookseller.
We aren't called to win the wars. We aren't called to protect God or to protect Christianity. We are simply called to be faithful.
Welcome to the Habit Podcast, conversations with writers about writing. I'm Jonathan Rogers, your host. Kristin Kobes Du Mez is an historian and professor at Calvin University. She's the author of Jesus and John Wayne, How White Evangelicals Corrupted a Faith and Fractured a Nation. Her indictment is hard to read. It was for me anyway. And while I'm not ready to embrace 100% of Kristin Du Mez's conclusions, Jesus and John Wayne is an impressive and important book. I commend it to you. Kristin Kobes Du Mez, thank you so much for being on the Habit Podcast today.
Oh, thank you for having me.
I'm so glad we get to talk. I want to start here with our conversation, and this the idea of storytelling as a way, or maybe the way, that we reframe our own understanding or help other people reframe their understanding of the world they live in.
Mm-hmm.
Right? And so, I mean, I think when I talk to writers, we talk about this idea that one of the great privileges of the writer is to be able to say, I know you thought you were living in this story, but as it turns out, you're living in this other story, and live into this story instead. And yet, if storytelling is a great force for truth-telling, it can also be a great force for falsehood. So anyway, the floor is now open to discuss that idea. Kristin.
Oh, yes. Yes. I love that framing. And honestly, when I set out to write Jesus and John Wayne, I was just writing a history. I was writing a history that I thought needed to be told. Since the book has come out, I've seen it be received in a way that maps onto exactly what you were saying. It is being received in a deeply personal way by people who have lived this life. I've gotten hundreds of letters from people who say some form of, this is the story of my life. So exactly those words. Yeah. And, but I never knew it was. And so one man said, I bumped up against all of these trees, but I never saw the forest before. And so I think the book is being seen as, being received as a new story, a story that suddenly makes sense of individual experiences in a way that is very different from what they thought their story was. Yeah. But they had already bumped up against the limits of their story as they had received it. Right, things weren't making sense. Their experiences. Some of them have really traumatic experiences in terms of their faith. their communities, their understanding of politics. And so this is a book that helps them to understand their stories in a way that actually gives them a sense of peace.
Huh. Interesting. Yeah. I mean, actually, before we started recording, I said something similar to you, that I thought of my life in sort of a lot of the names that you mentioned and book titles and that sort of thing were things that I knew, but I didn't quite understand how it all fit into a big picture. And, something you were just saying reminded me of this is I am paraphrasing James K. Smith, who is paraphrasing somebody who now I can't remember, Leslie. Oh shoot, I can't put
Newbigin?
No.
Okay.
It's a woman named Leslie. Anyway, her book is about 12-step recovery and I think her own recovery, and she talks about this idea, the 12-step story. When people tell their story in these 12-step programs, it's the same story over and over again. And as writers, we're always wanting to be original, but she was saying the comfort of that is knowing that I'm part of a story that I didn't write.
Yes.
And that to find my place in this other story, it's a comfort to us to know that there's, that there's the story of mine is a familiar story and not as unique as I thought it was.
Absolutely. Because otherwise I think there's a tendency to think, what did I do wrong? Right. What there's a source of, tension now maybe between, myself and my family or my church community, or, I don't fit with, I consider myself a Christian, but I don't fit with what I'm seeing. Or, there are many who have suffered, from abuse in religious communities. And I think their responses are the most poignant of, what did I do? And why did my community not support me? And there's a tendency to, think it's just your story and that you did something wrong. And when you realize that it is part of this bigger story, you are not alone. It doesn't make it any better, what happened, but I think it does give this sense of closure, actually, to see that you're part of something bigger and the people around you were part of something bigger. And so it's not just a personal thing. And then that enables you to process and I think and move on.
Yeah. Well, we should probably back up. We launched right into some things, and some of the listeners of this podcast may not even know what story we're talking about. So when people ask you to give a quick summary of Jesus and John Wayne, sorry, because I know you spent a lot of time and wrote a lot of pages. But what's the short story of what this book is about?
Sure. I've always considered it my book on white evangelical masculinity and militarism. And it's a history book. So it's tracing this strand throughout American history, throughout conservative white evangelicalism, really through the 20th century, but especially through the last 75 years up to the present moment. Mm-hmm.
So, Christians are, in principle at least, people of the book. And yet in your book, you tell the story of how, white evangelicals, who are some of the most vocal, people about the authority of Scripture, have somehow embraced stories of worldly power and, as you said, militarism that are clearly at odds. I say maybe I shouldn't say clearly at odds, because it's not perhaps clear to everybody with the teachings of Jesus, with the book. On the question of immigration, I know at one point in your book you talk about on the one hand, the Bible has so much to say, and the Old Testament prophets has so much to say about how we treat immigrants and the stranger, and yet, there's another story that overwhelms that story for conservative. Even and again, it's so hard to talk about these things, because I know there are plenty of people who, there's a variety of beliefs within the evangelical movement. So I don't want to paint with too broad too broad a brush, but anyway.
Yeah. So when I first started looking into the history of evangelical masculinity and militarism, this was more than 15 years ago, actually. So I've been kind of living with this project for a long time. I didn't quite know that it would turn into the book that it turned out to be. That really came together in the fall of 2016. But when I first started looking at very popular books on evangelical masculinity, books like John Eldredge's Wild at Heart, right, published in 2001, went on to sell more than 4 million copies. And this book was everywhere in evangelical circles for a decade, really, and it still lives today. What struck me was just how few Bible verses there were in terms of constructing a vision of Christian manhood. And those that were there were ripped out of context. And instead, I saw authors like Eldredge and those inspired by him really looking to Hollywood heroes, to kind of mythical warriors, to random soldiers as their models of Christian manhood. And that's where the title of the book comes from, Jesus and John Wayne. I could also have called it Jesus and Mel Gibson's William Wallace from the movie Braveheart, but that didn't quite roll off the tongue in the same way. And so what I saw happening then is evangelicals like looking outside of scriptures. These are quote unquote Bible believing evangelicals, right? Who are actually drawing inspiration on what it means to be a Christian man from these secular models, from kind of militaristic secular models. And then they bring that back into their faith, and that actually ends up transforming their faith, or as I put it, corrupting their faith, so that Christianity itself becomes a militant faith, so that the Jesus of the Gospels gets transformed into a kind of warrior Christ with tattoos down his leg, wielding a bloody sword and charging into battle. And so it really does transform the essence of Christianity itself.
Now, the image of the warrior Christ is not completely fictional, right?
Right. So you can find, you could talk about the armor of Christ. You could put on the armor of Christ. You can find the book of Revelation is actually a very a favorite book for those who are building up this very kind of militant conception of Christianity. But the Bible is a complicated book, right? And, we have theologians, we have pastors to help us understand how to read. We have tradition, we have confessions in the history of Christianity to help us understand how to interpret the scriptures. And now evangelicalism tends to set aside traditions of a certain sort, set aside confessions, and really champion the plain reading of the Bible. Like anybody can open the Bible and figure out what it's talking about. But in fact, they have their own cultural lenses that they apply. Yeah. And so what we see are, certain passages are really elevated and other passages are dismissed. And so, again, the Jesus of the Gospels, you've got the Beatitudes, you've got, instructions to love your neighbor as yourself, to turn the other cheek, to love your enemies. You have the fruit of the Spirit. You have all of these teachings that most would argue are pretty close to the core of Christianity and should frame the way we interpret the rest of the scriptures. You've got most of those really being set aside or defined as effeminate or feminine virtues, and that what it means to be a man, a Christian man, is to be following a warrior Christ and all that entails. And so it does really, it's not an abandonment of the scriptures, but it's a very particular way of reading the scriptures according to this lens of cultural and political values.
Mm-hmm. For some reason the other day, and this was even before I started reading your book, I was thinking about the song, Give Me That Old Time Religion.
Yes.
And which I was curious to know when it was written. Apparently it was about 1870, and which was actually a little older than I thought it was going to turn out to be. And but as you said before, in the Christian tradition, we have a tradition, right? We have a long centuries of people helping us to know how to make sense of, as you said, a complex book, and that the spirit of that song, Give Me That Old Time Religion, is it's not an old time religion we're talking about. It's a relatively recent development.
Exactly.
Although anything that has been around 1 year longer than I've been around feels old, right?
Right. Well, it feels old because evangelicals have been saying it's old, right? Evangelicals embraced that brand of old time religion. Evangelicals in the early 20th century really embraced, and when in fact they were innovators. And so when you have in the early 20th century, you have, the fundamentalist modernist divide. Modernists were really upfront that, hey, we are adapting the faith to modern times, and very, very open about that. Fundamentalists were also adapting the faith to modern times, right? They were moving away from denominational structures. They were moving away from traditional church authorities, and they were embracing celebrity. They were embracing kind of consumer culture as a way to evangelize. And a lot of this was really quite innovative, but they branded this as traditional. They branded this as old time religion. And here I'm really borrowing from the work of another historian, Tim Glegg, who wrote on the Moody Bible Institute and has really pioneered this work, which I think is really compelling. The fact that evangelicals kind of embraced or packaged their own innovative faith as old time religion and did so very effectively and kind of won that PR contest.
Yeah. Interesting. You're using the language of branding, you're using consumer language.
Yes.
Since my interest and my focus is writing, that sort of thing. I mean, I know yours is too, but I'm talking about teaching writing.
Uh-huh.
I would have talked about competing stories, and which is another way of saying the same thing.
Yeah.
But man, that language of branding is, something about that hurts my feelings.
Right. Well, I mean, it is the story that we tell ourselves about ourselves, but it's not just a story we're telling ourselves. It's also the story that we're insisting that others accept, right? It's our outward facing story. And when we, or when we look at evangelicals branding themselves as old time religion, branding themselves as traditional Christianity, there's an implicit kind of us versus them claim that other Christians are not the old time religion, that other Christians are, diverging from traditional Christianity. So there are some truth claims that are part of that as well. And I think those truth claims are pretty central to evangelical identity. Now, all of us like to think that our stories are the true stories. Evangelicals are not unique in that. But I think they have perhaps leaned into that a little bit more and place that at the core of their identity. And it has been an oppositional identity throughout the 20th century up to the present. We are against others. We have this truth that others do not have. And that's why it is so important that we protect our story, that we protect our witness.
Mm-hmm. I'm going to resist the temptation to ask a different question that will send us off on a rabbit trail. Let's talk about fear, because fear is such an important part of, fear is such an incredibly powerful motivator. Mm-hmm. And there's a kind of story that gins up fear as a way of consolidating power and manipulating people and that kind of stuff. And hopefully I'd say hopefully there is a story. There are stories that release us from fear.
Yeah.
One of the, there are so many ironies in the stories that you're telling here. And I will identify two, and you can talk about whatever other ones one is that this call to manly courage, for instance, is the way, it is, I'm going to stir up enough fear in you that you're going to have to go out and show some manly courage.
Yes.
That's one irony that we can talk about. And then the other is the gospel is a promise of a release from fear.
Yes.
The gospel says, hey, this story, that this fearful, all this fear you're living in, the truth is the reality, as it turns out, is better than this fearful world where you find yourself.
Yes.
And yet that's not how these stories that we're talking about have been working for the last, as you said, 75 years or so.
Yeah. So I almost opened the book with a quote from Marilyn Robinson, that fear is not a Christian habit of mind. And really debated. I ended up not, because this is, that's a theological claim, right? And I couldn't really, as a historian, validate that. Unfortunately, the story I'm telling it is very much a Christian habit of mind if we're looking at this particular history. So, the question of fear, initially when I approached this, I was kind of working with the popular understanding that to understand evangelical politics, to understand sometimes evangelical extremism, you just really have to understand that they are very afraid. So they're afraid of demographic changes, the end of white Christian America. They are afraid of being marginalized. They are afraid of, in the past, they're afraid of communism, and then they're afraid of secular humanism, and they're afraid of liberalism, and they're afraid of their way of life, and all of these things. And so, of course, then they're going to respond with militancy. They're gonna respond with extreme actions from time to time because they are so afraid. And that was very much the kind of rhetoric around the evangelical vote for Trump in 2016. They were very afraid. And so can you really blame them? Push them into the arms of a man like Donald Trump. And then when I started looking at the history, I ended up needing to flip that script, actually. I, rather than taking the fear for granted, and then seeing militancy as a response to that fear, in one case after another, in local churches, in Jerry Falwell Sr.'s Thomas Road Baptist Church, in Mark Driscoll's Mars Hill Church, in these crazy stories about fake ex-Muslim terrorists that took the speaking circuit by storm in the post 9/11 years. Over and over again, I saw that actually the fear was being manufactured by evangelical leaders. So it was being stoked in the hearts of their followers. And then that fear was real. Like followers, they were legit afraid of communists, and they were legit afraid of radical Islam. And then they were acting accordingly. And within this kind of militant framework, the way when you are afraid, you seek protection. And those who were stoking their fears were promising protection. I will protect you, right? The strong man. I will protect you. You stay within the fold of our church. Don't go to that church down the road. And this is a time of war, right? A lot of this military rhetoric. And within war, absolute loyalty is demanded. It is required, right? You follow your orders, you obey your leaders. And I came to see how it wasn't that fear often stoked militancy or led to militancy, although that was part of what was happening, but kind of chicken and egg. But really, it was often the militancy that first required fear, that required the continual stoking of fear in order to sustain itself. And once I saw that in the history, things just clicked for me. And I saw that was a pattern that is repeated over and over again.
So is there since fear is such an important, it's such a powerful force, you're a writer, an historian, what are your thoughts on how we tell other kinds of stories that release people from fear?
Yeah, I think we need to look those fears in the eye and really deconstruct them. What is the worst thing that could happen? What is, let's take fears around religious liberty. Right? That fears that with a increasingly pluralistic society, that Christians might not be able to live their faith out in all areas of life exactly as they see fit through their own institutions and through laws and so on. And I work at a Christian university. I work at a Christian institution that would probably see some changes if there was an erosion in religious liberty and so on. But let's just follow that road, where it takes us. What is the worst thing that can happen? What really happens to our faith? What happens to our life? What happens to our witness? Are we going to be okay? My favorite quote in the book actually is towards the end of the book, and it's a quote from Rachel Denhollander. And it's in a slightly different context, a relevant context. Rachel Denhollander was the first witness in the Larry Nassar case on sexual abuse among MSU gymnasts. and really kind of broke that case open. And then she became an advocate also for survivors in cases of abuse in evangelical circles and in religious circles. She has this powerful quote that is responding to the tendency of Christians in particular to cover up abuse. And she says, to protect the witness of the church. She says, God does not need your protection. God only asks for your obedience, right? And so it's this question ultimately of power, really. We aren't called to win the wars. We aren't called to win the culture wars. We aren't called to protect God or to protect Christianity. We are simply called to be faithful. And what does that look like? She says it's pursuing justice. And it's that simple. It takes courage, and it's not grasping at power. And I think that's actually her quote there is the moral center of the entire book for me.
Yeah, that is so good. And one thing I want to talk about, Kristin, while I have you, is the idea of confirmation bias, which we tend to think the people who disagree with us sure do have bad confirmation bias.
Of course we do.
Yeah. And so this is an academic, this is an academic book that has a thesis. And I was an academic. I wrote a dissertation, had a thesis, and believe it or not, everything in the world, as it turns out, confirmed my thesis. Right. Yeah. And so, as I was reading through your book, it was so comprehensive. It was like this unifying theory. Yeah. So unifying that I felt a little suspicious. Right. I mean, that turns out John Wayne is everywhere. Everybody knows John Wayne. And so can we talk about that a little bit? I mean, you, as a writer and a thinker, and when you get a theory you're excited about, how do you trust that you're not just seeing everything as confirmation of your theory?
This is such a gentle framing of a very pointed question. So thank you for that. Yes. Right. So first, what I'd say is, yes, this is a thesis-driven book. And to clarify, this is not a history of evangelicalism. It's not a history of American evangelicalism. It's not a history of white evangelicalism, right? This is a history of white evangelical masculinity and militarism. And that is the thread that I am pulling through this 75-year history. Now, if it's a little unclear, let me say that. So this is also, it's an academic book, tons of footnotes, but it's also written for general audiences. It's with a trade publisher. And one of their rules right up front was when it came to the title, I was not allowed to use the word masculinity or militarism in the title. Right? Too big. Nobody's going to pick that book off the shelf. So I was like, okay, I went with a trade publisher for a reason. We'll work with it. But it was a challenge. It was a challenge for me and my editor. So we had to really come down to, okay, what is this book essentially about? But yes, it's a book about white evangelical masculinity and militarism. And so confirmation bias. So I was tracing that pattern throughout. That said, when I was pitching the book, one of the editors that I ended up in front of, he pushed back against that. And he said, no, this is more than that, Kristin. This is a book this is a new history of evangelicalism. And I said, no, that's not what I'm after here. It's a much narrower topic. And then I signed with another publisher, worked with another editor. About 3 months into the writing process, I was sitting here in my office, working through a tangled chapter. And all of a sudden it dawned on me, I think this is a new history of evangelicalism. And his words came back to me. But it's not, right? It's a strand that I'm arguing it becomes a dominant strand within white evangelicalism. It is not the only thing, but it is something that even the other strands are going to be bumping up against. They're going to be encountering this. And so I'm very attentive to questions of affinities, of power dynamics, of how this plays out, even for those who resist it, even for those who offer alternative paths, who actually controls the mainstream. One of the big questions running through the book is, what is mainstream evangelicalism and what is marginal? What is on the fringe? And that's something that I try to tease out. And that's something that really, I think, shifts over time. A couple of other things on confirmation bias. So I had a team of student researchers working with me who were fabulous. 3 researchers stayed with me for 2 to 3 years on this project. And I regularly gave them the advice. They saw the picture, the big themes. They knew what I was looking for. And I told them over and over again, the best thing you can do for me is bring me evidence that counters my thesis. Like, don't just go out there and look for the stuff. It was really easy to find stuff that confirms my thesis. I'm most interested. Show me the stuff that disrupts it. Right. And I just had to keep looking for that. I will also say that, I had some skeptical readers, a couple historians who I think pre-publication, not a fan of this book or the thesis, and one in particular, and asked to read it, a senior scholar. And so I had him read it, and he, I think would agree on some or disagree on some points or places of emphasis more. But by the time he reached the end, I think he'd converted. And what was really interesting to me is to see in subsequent weeks, he would send me emails of things he saw, of evidence, of images, of top 10 lists of this evangelical pastor, 8 of which were on military leadership, right? Kind of things. And once you have eyes to see this, you are going to see it a lot of places, right? It does actually describe a lot of what we're seeing. And I think that's been a really common response to this book is once you have this thesis, you're going to see how it does make sense of an awful lot of things, but always look for who does this not apply to, right? Who does this not, for whom is this not the story of their life, for which evangelicals, and then why? And those are very fair questions to ask. So, okay, I'm going to push one more time on this. The phrase, once you have eyes to see it, you see it everywhere. Yeah. Isn't that the definition of confirmation bias? Well, yes, in some ways, but I suppose. Okay, let me step that back a little bit. You're going to see it many places, right? It's going to, you realize that this was just part of the air that you were breathing. And it didn't really strike you as distinctive. It didn't strike you as particularly relevant. It was just the way things were. So, ideas of the Christian nationalism, of linking the Christian gospel to American exceptionalism, which is also linked to this militarism, to if you go back in Christian history, like you can see, you can find instances of Christian, militarism. You can also find a pretty strong tradition of Christian pacifism. So it just makes us ask, why this choice now? Same thing with regard to masculinity and this kind of rugged warrior masculinity, which really makes no sense if you read the New Testament. It makes very little sense, I should say. This denigration of Mr. Rogers' masculinity in evangelical circles. These are the kinds of things that might not grab your attention, but when they do precisely because now you realize this doesn't really make sense, right? This is something that needs to be explained. This is something that needs to be problematized. And this isn't the direct outgrowth of, reading the scriptures. It's not. It's something else. And all of these things fit together over here. And we really have been embracing them as this is just simply how you be a Christian in this day and age. And it's actually not. It's a lot more. Yeah. Yeah. Well, to be fair, as I was picking on the statement, once you see it, once you have the eyes to see it, you see it everywhere. That's true for confirmation bias. It's true for conspiracy theory, but it's also true for the truth. And so, and that's what's so difficult about talking about so many of these things. And that's one of many things that are difficult about talking about these things is that truth and crazy conspiracy theory, there's some overlap in the way it feels, right? Yeah. Yeah. When you are feeling it or sensing it. Well, one thing you say, I think this is in your conclusion or epilogue or whatever it's called, is that what has been done can be undone. Yeah. And that the kind of the state of our culture is not inevitable. It's something that was engineered by people in many ways, and therefore it can be undone. I started to say reverse engineered. That's not what that means, but can you say just a little bit more about that? Yeah. So when I got that last line wasn't in my near final draft of the manuscript, actually. And when my editor made it all the way through the book, and I think it was a second or third read, all the big problems had been taken care of, or most of them, he came to me and said, this book is really depressing. And can you give your readers something? Can you not leave them in this place? And so I thought, okay. And I took a look and I thought, and after a day or so, I responded to him and I said, I've got nothing. I mean, I honestly, as historian tracking this history, I find it very heavy because these values are so deeply embedded. This understanding of the relationship between Christianity and power, this white patriarchy, this militancy. It's not an encouraging story. I don't think I can, in all honesty. And he said, okay, I respect that. And then a couple of days later, I got another email like, Kristin, can you just give us something? Give us something. And that's when I gave him that last line. And I cringed as I sent it off to him, because I felt like it was just too feeble. But in fact, I think it is true. It is true. That is the power of history. Precisely what you said. None of this was inevitable. And if we can understand, and yet evangelicals in particular, I think we all tend to think that, our own values or whatever we've come to as truth it's God ordained, or it's natural, or it's the truest truth. Right? We all have the tendency, but maybe evangelicals a little more than others, that, all this is God ordained gender roles, Christian America, all of this stuff. But if we can see that it wasn't always this way, that Christian masculinity in this country looked different, that conservative Protestants used to have different views on militarism, on the idea of Christian America, that these issues hadn't always come together in the way they did in more recent decades. And then we can see how and why and who was making these choices, and often, and for what motivations. Frequently, it was to enhance their own power. Yeah. Once we can understand that, it doesn't tell us what we should do, but it helps us to ask that question in much more productive ways. Is this where we want to be? Is this how Christianity should shape our own nation? Is this faithful Christianity? And it allows us to ask those questions in fresh ways. And so I do think that what was once done can be undone. And that sentence has been, I think, very powerful to readers who the next question is, yes, and what can I do to help undo this?
Yeah. Well, as you know, this is a podcast about writing for writers. And so, I think the way I would say what happens, what writers can do is just tell the truer story.
Yes. Yeah. Telling the truth. As some of the responses to this book were a little, it's been called an urgent and sharp-elbowed book. And I think that's an apt description. For some folks within evangelicalism, they raise questions of, was this really the best tone to use? It is sharp-elbowed. And I'm open to that. That was the question I had as I was writing it. This is the way the words came out. And this is the way that I thought I could tell the most powerful truth. Not giving deference where no deference was due, because I think that's something within evangelical communities. There is so much deference given to authority and to particular authorities. And I didn't want to participate in that. And I wanted to make that very clear. And so, that was also a kind of writerly choice that I made. And I think in part, that's why it's been so popular within evangelical circles, because the books that they write for each other tend to be softer, gentler books. They tend to show deference towards those who hold power. And I think they tend to blunt the truth in many cases. And I think that's where this book cuts through in a way that others perhaps haven't.
Good. I think it's so important that we draw a distinction between the status quo and reality.
Yeah.
And that we are accountable to reality.
Yeah.
And by the way, we're probably going to disagree about what reality is, and we can enter a conversation about that. And I'm not 100% sure you and I agree about what about what reality is, and that's okay too, right? And the fact, I think a mutual commitment to reality makes it possible for us to, where we disagree, to be allies to one another and say, if we both care about reality, it's not that big of a deal if it turns out you're right or I'm right, or if neither one of us is right.
Yeah.
And
So have a little humility and throw that in the mix. And I think too, that this book is a work of history. It's not a work of theology. It's not trying to woo evangelicals to change their minds. The bulk of the book really is, it's a history. It's filled with quotes. It's filled with people that they would recognize. It's filled with the books that are on their bookshelves. And so it's really showing them that reality and then and setting that in a context of a broader reality. And I think that's another way that this book can cut through. A lot of it is pretty undeniable, right? You've got the footnotes. You can track the evidence and you can see, oh yeah, that is what Billy Graham said. That's right.
Yeah.
I didn't realize that, because that's not the stories they tell themselves frequently. And they have their heroes and they have their stories, and for many, there are just so many revelations here that there are other truths that had not been part of the stories they were telling themselves. Yeah,
great. All right, Kristin, I always end with this question. Every episode ends with the question: who are the writers who make you want to write?
Okay. I'm a fan of Tim Tyson. So he's the author of a book on Emmett Till, also Blood Done Sign My Name. And he just has this amazing way of weaving history with narrative, personal reflection, and underneath it all, just a real kind of moral impulse. And so I think he has elevated that to an art form. So I admire his writing. I'm a fan of, as a historian, I really like Jamar Tisby's writing. And he's just very clear and ends up just kind of with authority and grace, just getting right to the heart of things, including all of the facts in just a really tight narrative. And I have a lot, but I'll limit it to three. I'm also a fan of Kate Bowler's work, both her history and her memoir. To bring a little bit of her personality, she brings a lot of her personality to her writing. Very clear, but also with a little sense of humor, a little irony, a little bite here and there. And so she's another writer that I admire. Although she doesn't make me. I think what the question you gave me to think of ahead of time was, who makes you want to write more? She's the kind of person when I read her, I'm like, I think I'll just hang up my hat and, just let her write all the books. So some writers are, inspired, then some writers are just like, you should just write all the books.
Right. Well, the good news is nobody can write all the books.
Exactly.
So. All right. Kristin Du Mez, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you. It was a pleasure.
What do you do next?
This podcast is brought to you by The Rabbit Room, where art nourishes community and community nourishes art. And all our podcasts are made possible by the generous support of our members. To learn more about us, visit rabbitroom.com, and to become a member, rabbitroom.com/donate. Special thanks as well to Taylor Linhart for letting us use her song Diamonds as the theme music for Season 3 of the Habit podcast. You can learn more about Taylor and follow her work at taylorlinhart.com.
The Habit membership is a library of resources for writers by me, Jonathan Rogers. More importantly, The Habit is a hub of community where like-minded writers gather to discuss their work and give each other a little more courage. Find out more at thehabit.co.
If you've enjoyed this podcast episode, consider joining the Rabbit Room membership. Your membership helps sustain this community, funding everything from publishing and podcasts and theater productions to events and programs that support artists who create with a Christ-centered vision. We'd love to have you on board. Learn more at rabbitroom.com/member.